Thanks, Chris. We're being recorded, just to make a note here. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Bear with us as we get our slides pulled together. We've got a lot of information and good debate, good dialogue that's we'd like to have happen today. So we'll kind of just dive in here. Tom is, sorry for this last minute switch, Tom is going to present the slideshow and we'll just roll through it here. So we have just a couple basic information on the WebEx software if you're not familiar with it. The people who are in the software program themselves, it's pretty straightforward. There is a little icon down at the bottom if you want to raise your hand. It's sort of in the lower right corner. You can raise your hand and lower your hand if you want to ask a question. There's also the chat feature that's open there. So if people want to type in a question or a comment into the chat while we're going on, you can really do so. As you see from the agenda, would have seen from the agenda that we sent out last week, we have some time scheduled on the agenda for both presentations from staff as well as times for discussion and debate amongst the RAC members. But of course, if you have interim questions or chat features, please go ahead and ask them, and we'll do the best we can to get to it there. Tom, I see your slideshow. Thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate it. So if you're on the phone, it looks like everybody from my list, on the panelist on the RAC list is in the webinar software itself. But if that's not the case, if you're on the phone, you have a little bit different function here. You press *3 on your telephone keypad to raise and lower your little hand there to indicate you have a question. And there's a mute unmute feature on the phone as well, which is *6. And again, if you're on the WebEx itself, there's a little hand function down in the corner, but there we go. All right, let's get going. So thanks, welcome everybody. This is our first Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for the Radioactive Waste Disposal Rulemaking Project. As it says here on the screen, this is housed in Oregon Administrative Rule 345, Division 50. That's the rule set we're going to be talking about over the coming months. Thank you again for being here. I really want to start by just welcoming and thanking everybody. Your organizations or your governments have been appointed to this Rulemaking Advisory Committee, or RAC, we'll just use the shorthand RAC, by the Energy Facility Siting Council. And I want to acknowledge that everybody here as individuals have agreed to participate on the RAC and really spend your time, your energy on this process. It's valuable for us, and I hope it's valuable for you. Thank you again. Your contributions are really appreciated and valued. I'll introduce the team here, the Oregon Department of Energy staff that are with us today and that will be with us through the RAC process. And then a little bit, so I have a couple slides information, and then we'll have people on the RAC introduce themselves as we kind of get into it and make sure that our time is used appropriately. So again, so I'm Max Woods. I'm Assistant Director for Nuclear Safety and Emergency Preparedness, which is kind of a lengthy title, here at the Oregon Department of Energy. And with us, we have three folks, other people on my team here. Jeff Burright, Radioactive Waste Remediation Specialist. We have Chris Clark, the Policy Analyst and Rules Coordinator. Chris just went off his video, but you'll get a lot of emails from Chris, and he's our person who helps manage the rulemaking process. And then Tom Cecilia, whose title is Hanford Hydrogeologist, which indicates his primary focus, but Tom's part of our team for the in-state radioactive waste disposal rule process and implementation as well. So thanks again. Let's just dive right in. Like I said, we got 3 hours to try and get through some material, so we'll kind of keep it moving along. Tom, can you go to the next slide? All right, quick overview here. I have some brief slides on process, on what we're doing, why we're doing it today, and as well as not just today, but in the coming months. Trying to get everybody a common understanding of the process and the objectives of the RAC. And I'll note that, as I mentioned before, you would have seen this on the agenda. We have multiple times today where we'll have open dialogue and directed questions towards the RAC, and hoping to have some good feedback and make sure that this is not just me and Jeff talking at you all day, but that we have good dialogue here. Just to note about the materials that people have received. Last week, Chris sent out an email, had the agenda for today, had a RAC charter, which sort of a brief document outlining the objectives, a bit of the process, schedule, and the RAC membership. We also sent a copy of the existing rule set. We sent a copy of Senate Bill 246, which was passed by the Oregon legislature in the long session a few months ago. We'll talk about that bill, what it does. We also provided links to Odo's testimony on Senate Bill 246 for more context about that bill specifically, but also some information on the broader rulemaking process and the issues. And I'll note that the presentations that you'll see today from me and from Jeff have just been posted to our website. Apologies we didn't get those out sooner. You can imagine we've been working to get those finalized in the last couple of minutes, shall we say. All right, next slide, please. Thanks, Tom. So this is a slide about the rulemaking, not just the RAC, but the rulemaking process flowchart, right? So here we are. We have at the very beginning initiation of rulemaking. That's done by the Energy Facility Siting Council. I have a slide on what the FSAC's role is coming up next. But just to sort of show where we are in space and time, here we are, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. The Rulemaking Advisory Committee process is actually considered a subset of the development of the draft proposed rules chevron right there. And as we mean is as we proceed through the RAC process over the coming months, our intention is that we'll be gathering input from the RAC. We'll draft proposed rules. We'll come back to the RAC. We'll discuss those rules. We'll review them. And we may do that process a few times, ultimately, before we get draft proposed rules that staff will give to the Energy Facility Siting Council for their consideration. All right, next slide, please, Tom. Okay, I have a slide here on the role of the RAC in the rulemaking process. This information is mostly taken from the charter, the RAC charter that we sent out, but really trying to get to some of the very important high-level points and specific objectives of the RAC. Just to note, we plan to meet 3 to 6 times over the coming months, probably closer to 6 than 3. To be honest, I think we have a lot of material to get through and a lot of good discussion to be had. And I'll note that the last bullet is pretty important to keep in mind. We're seeking your advice as individuals, as representatives of your organization, and we're not expecting consensus from the group. Just keep that in mind. This is how a RAC process in Oregon state government works. It's not a consensus. If there are conflicting opinions on what the rules should look like, we'll make sure that the Energy Facility Siting Council has all the information that we generate out of this RAC and that they can understand the positions of all the parties involved. It's not a consensus. I want to make just a quick note about what we're taking into a philosophy on these RAC meetings and the rulemaking process. Really, we're trying to have a very open approach, right? And you can see from today's meeting, as we might consider this almost a scoping meeting for the RAC process. We really want to have open, honest dialogue, as that 5th bullet on the screen shows. And as you'll see later in Jeff's presentation, well, I should say, we have no draft proposed rules written right now. We have staff, we haven't done that. We wanted to make sure this process is true to the intention and that the RAC has open input to what the rules would look like. But of course, we've been working in this rule set for many years as staff and particularly over the last 2 years. You'll see in Jeff's presentation a little bit later that we do have a list of specific questions that we want to get into over the rulemaking process. So we're not coming into this without a frame of reference, without important questions for us to talk about. But like I mentioned, we don't have a draft rules set behind the scenes right now, just to be honest about that. All right, next slide, Tom. Good in mind. Quick slide on the role of FSAC. Just to remind everybody, the Energy Facility Siting Council, or FSAC, is sort of the shorthand as people might refer to it, is the decision-making body for this rule set, and that comes from statute. And just if people aren't aware, the council is a 7-member volunteer board. They are appointed by the governor and they are confirmed by the Oregon Senate to fulfill that responsibility on the council. There's a process points on this slide as well. And so everybody is aware, once FSAC releases its draft proposed rules based on the input from the RAC, it will hold public comment period, except written comments. The council will also have a public hearing at which it will accept oral comments directly to FSAC. Those public hearings are typically at a regularly scheduled FSAC meeting, and we expect that to occur sometime next year. And as it mentions here, we don't expect the rules to be finalized until next summer. We have a bit of a process. All right, next slide here. All right, so there's a lot of information here on this slide, and I'll talk through some of the notes and try and keep it moving along. Really, this is the background. So why are we here today? As many people know, we as ODO staff have been more engaged on radioactive waste disposal in the past 2 years. And this follows an illegal disposal incident at the Chem Waste facility, Chem Waste Management Hazardous Waste Landfill facility. It's a hazardous waste landfill facility in Gillum County outside of Arlington. And this led our agency to do a couple things beyond the immediate response to that specific incident at Chem Waste. So we did work with the Oregon legislature on Senate Bill 246. We'll discuss that a little bit later today. That bill directs us to conduct this rulemaking as sort of one of the directives from that bill itself, or directs FSEC, I should say, to conduct this rulemaking. Senate Bill 246 also changes the definition of radioactive waste. It expands the potentially responsible parties for illegal waste disposal to include waste generators, and transporters, in addition to disposal facilities. And it gives FSEC and our agency broader prevention and investigation authorities. And we'll get to all that, sort of what those mean as we move on through the process here. Other things that we've done. Our agency now puts out an annual notice to landfills across the state regarding the radioactive waste rules. We've increased our coordination with our partner state agencies, Department of Environmental Quality and Oregon Health Authority's Radiation Protection Services, or RPS group, and both of those organizations, agencies are represented on our RAC as well. So we appreciate that coordination with our state agencies. And I will also note that we've been working specifically with Waste Management in reviewing their waste profiles for potential sources of radioactive waste and assessing compliance with the rules and statutes. And finally, the last bullet notes, we've been reviewing multiple pathway exemption requests in recent months. And we'll get into what that means a little bit later. But I'll just, as a very high level, note that the pathway exemption is a process currently in the rule, in the Division 50 rule set, which requires a specific set of physical tests and laboratory analyses assessed against the output of those analyses is assessed against criteria that are set in rule to determine if a particular waste stream is radioactive waste or not, and thus allowable or not for disposal in the state. And we'll talk about all this more at future RAC meetings. I'm just trying to set the stage of where we are right now. All right, Tom, next slide here. Broad rulemaking project objectives. As I've sort of mentioned before, implement directives from Senate Bill 246. We'll get into that a little bit later. Evaluate whether changes to rules are needed to protect public health and safety. Pretty fundamental charge to FSEC and to this RAC. And then consider what, if any, standards and rules are necessary to prevent disposal of radioactive waste in Oregon. And that last bullet also comes from the statute from SB 246. Okay, so that's sort of my quick rundown and probably enough of me talking. So what I'd like to do now is we'll go around the virtual room and if everybody could just take a second to introduce themselves and then respond to the question, I guess there's actually questions posed here on the screen. I'll note that this is the same questions that were posed in the agenda. So hopefully people had a chance to look at that and contemplate, what exactly the response they'd like to give. The idea here is we really want to make sure that we understand where all the RAC members, where the organizations are coming from, your interest in the rulemaking, and really just trying to set the stage for future meetings. And so we get a fuller understanding, so all the RAC members get a full understanding of where a person is coming from and what you hope, as it mentions here, what you hope the rulemaking will accomplish. So if folks will bear with me, I think I'll just call on the representatives from organizations that I have on my list in alphabetical order by name of the organization, which puts the Association of Oregon Counties, AOC, up first. Do we have Drenda on the line? And our very first person I call on, I don't know if we do. Chris, do you know if Drenda is on the line? We have a call-in user at 503-267.
Oh, that's Dave Smith. I don't believe that Dendra is on the line.
Okay, we will move over that. Going down my list in the next order is Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation and Mason Murphy. Mason, thank you for joining us. Could you give a quick introduction and perhaps if you can respond to this question?
Mason, I'm sorry. We see that you're unmuted, but we can't hear you, unfortunately. You may need to try to go down to the unmute button, and there should be a little caret there that says audio options, and then adjust your microphone setting there.
No luck. Sorry, Mason. Why don't we roll down to the next, and Mason will see if we'll come back to you. We can work on the audio there. So next, Gillum County Government and Lisa. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Lisa Atkin. I'm Chief of Staff at Gillum County. And I also was fortunate to be on the RAC panelists previously. So thank you for inviting me back. I appreciate the offer to participate again. So from my perspective, being Gillum County, I kind of have various lenses I'm looking at this through. Obviously, representing county government is one of my primary focuses, but also as county government, we're obviously looking to reflect the best interests, particularly safety of our constituents. So also looking at it through that lens. And then our waste management, and I see Jim Denson is back as a panelist too, so that's awesome, is one of our key and main private employers here in Gillum County. So that's a further lens that I'm looking at this through, but obviously Jim has far more technical expertise in that area, and so we'll probably take the lion's share of that perspective.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Welcome. Mason.
Yeah, let's try that again, huh?
Yeah, there it is.
Oh gosh, a little troubleshooting. Here we are. Hello, everyone. My name is Mason Murphy. I represent the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I'm the Energy and Environmental Science Program Manager, and overall, one of our principal goals is to try and protect tribal treaty rights that were retained in the tribal treaty rights and resources that were retained in the Treaty of 1855. There's a broad swath of land that includes, which has an assortment of various landfills, one of which the Arlington landfill is at. So we are definitely interested in this rulemaking because we would like to ensure that those resources are protected from environmental contaminants. And I'm hoping that this rulemaking accomplishes some piece of that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mason. Appreciate you being here. Next on my list is League of Women Voters of Oregon and Shirley Weathers. I don't see Shirley on the panelist list, though. Chris, are you aware of?
Yes, sorry, Max. Shirley did call this morning and let me know that she would be trying to join part of this meeting, but had a conflict.
Oh, okay. Okay. We can circle. Shirley Weathers represents League of Women Voters of Oregon on the rec. Next on my list is Oregon Business and Industry and Charlotte Moffett.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to go over to my notes here. Thank you for having me, Charlotte Moffett. I'm the Director of Energy, Environment, Natural Resources, and Infrastructure for Oregon Business and Industry. OBI is a statewide business association. We have about 1,600 members. Our members and our interests on this RAC include generators of naturally occurring radioactive waste or material, I should say material, and haulers and disposal operators. And so we kind of represent the gamut. And so we were very interested in the rulemaking, want to make sure that any proposed rules are science-based, consistent, and clearly promulgated. And it really boils down to some regulatory certainty for the business community to ensure that regulations are applied fairly and uniformly to generators and disposal operators, and that they're able to move through this process in a timely fashion, and that it's not dragged out over many months. So I have, many other things I could say, but I think that again, just really clearly promulgated rules means that generators, disposal operators, and members of the public can understand or easily understand what types of material are being disposed at what levels, how that is protective of public health and safety, as well as the environment, and further that compliance regulations are clear to everyone, including members of the public. So I'll stop there for now and have lots to say later. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlotte. Really appreciate it. All right, next on my list is Oregon DEQ and Jamie Jones.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay, so my name is Jamie Jones. I work for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I'm a senior permitting and policy specialist, and I'm also the statewide lead for financial assurance for solid waste disposal sites like landfills and things like that. So where we intersect, DEQ of environmental quality, our focus is the protection of land, water, air for the state. I'm part of the land quality group. And so when we talk about land disposal sites or disposal facilities and things like that, the thing that I'm interested in and, is where these regulations meet our regulations and how we work together. The thing I'm really hoping that we accomplish are like clear compliance points and coordination between the agencies. So.
Great, thanks, Jamie.
Thanks.
Next on my list, the state agencies are going through them: Oregon Health Authority, RPS, and Hillary.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Hillary Haskins. I'm from Oregon Health Authority, and I am the Operations and Emergency Response Manager. Oregon Health Authority's role is the regulation of use of radioactive materials and ensuring that people use and dispose of them properly. And so we're kind of that transition from regulated use to the disposal, which is now then ODO's responsibility. And so for us, we want to make sure that our rules are very clear and that transition is clear. We just want to make sure that we're doing our best to protect Oregonians and the environment and work with all of our partners in industry and our state partners.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hillary. All right, next is Oregon Metro and Kevin Six.
Yes, Kevin Six, and I'm a senior solid waste planner in a systems planning group at Metro. Metro is a regional government in the Portland area. We both regulate the waste flow within the region, and then we also own and contract out the operations at 2 transfer stations. So we're interested in accurately identifying waste and its safe collection at and through the region, as well as the transfer and disposal. We're obviously, like we mentioned in the last previous 2 people, we're looking for clear rules that we can apply across the region as well as the state, so accurately and clear making will benefit us all.
Thanks, Kevin. Very good. All right, next is Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and Damon, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Damon Mott-Story. I'm on the advisory board of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Was on some similar rulemaking work with some of you before, so good to see you again. And Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility's main objective here is around protection of public health from radioactive materials and hazards. We shared in the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 for work on documenting the impacts of nuclear weapons testing on particularly in children's teeth, and then since then have remained active in watchdogging and being involved in tracking the health impacts of various radioactive wastes and materials.
Thanks, Damon. Great. All right, next we have Oregon Refuse and Recycling Association. Andrea.
Thanks, Max. Apologies, the camera, I'm having some glitches, but I think everybody can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, great. Thanks so much. First, Andrea Fogg, Governmental Affairs Director for the Oregon Refuse and Recycling Association. Thanks very much to all the background work that Odo has done in preparation for this rulemaking. It is of great interest to ORA and our members. ORA is the trade association that represents all of those garbage and recycling haulers that you see across the state, from big companies to small family-owned companies. That includes, of course, things like landfills and transfer stations. So we're both on the transportation interest with this, as well as disposal. And our priority is health and safety. And that means, protecting citizens and the environment, and doing that in a way that also provides some certainty for our members. That means knowing and understanding what the scope is, what's considered radioactive waste, clarity in these rules and how they will be applied, really trying to avoid unintended consequences. And so that we really understand what this landscape looks like. So we will, look forward, that's just a very high level, look forward to working through these issues as the rulemaking goes on. And so I'm participating today, and Dora will be, closely engaged and watching. We do have an expert that's going to participate, really also in our seat as well. He couldn't join us today at a prior conflict. His name is Andy Lombardo, and he works for Permafix. And Permafix is a nuclear, all nuclear companies, lots of experience with radioactive waste. He has decades of experience, working nationally on these issues with rules and guidelines that have been established. And so we're looking forward to him being a helpful resource for the RAC. Thanks, Max.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Andrea. Appreciate it. All right, next on my list, we also have we have Oregon State University's Radiation Center, and Steve Reese is on the RAC, although I don't think Steve is here quite yet. He's coming later today. He had a conflict right now. So I'm going to go next to, on my list, is to the members of the public at large. Dave Smith. If Dave is speaking, you're on mute. Chris, can you unmute Dave? Was Dave the call-in user 267?
Hi, yeah, and I'm not sure if I can unmute him from here, but Dave, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6, I believe. Great, and it looks like you should be unmuted.
There, Dave, nothing yet. All right, we might come back to Dave. The next person on my list, another public at large member, Wayne.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good.
Thanks for joining.
I spent 30 years in the field, 10 of it in nuclear power. So anyway, if we did a show of hands, I suspect I might be the only one that raises it that actually has gone into a landfill and tried to find a missing source, which is pretty miserable experience, I just wanted to say. And if this helps not to prevent having somebody else do something like that, I'd be very inclined to support it. So anyway, that was when I was in graduate school, which was a long time ago. But anyway, to the extent I can be helpful, that's fine. I'm actually certified in the field of health physics.
Thanks, Wayne. Appreciate you to be here. Dave, can you try again with Dave Smith's audio? Still nothing. Keep trying on that.
Can you hear, hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Oh, this is Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Excellent. Go ahead.
I don't know what changed, but okay. All right. My name's Dave Smith. I'm retired from the Oregon Health Authority, or it was called the Health Division when I worked for them, as a radiation safety regulator, and 20 years with the Department of Energy as radioactive materials manager and the council secretary for about 15 years. I have a lot of experience with these rules. I wrote a number of them and was involved with enforcing them for probably 25 years, one way or another. So I'm interested in, what the possibilities are here. I'm also an environmental radiochemist, and I have been, for many years, I was pretty much the only individual in the state who developed the ability to do all of the tests for the pathway criteria in the existing rules. And some of those, I've told the staff at Odo before, I think are perhaps unnecessarily cumbersome. And so I'm really interested in what we can do to make the whole process work better. I guess that's it.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Glad you're here.
You too.
Last on my alphabetical order, waste management, and Jim Denson.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Denson. I'm the Pacific Northwest British Columbia Area Environmental Protection Manager for Waste Management. I want to thank the department for having me on this committee. It's definitely of interest to waste management. With respect to our interests and the questions, my personal hope for this meeting or these meetings is to develop a clear and easy to understand rules that provide for safety of Oregonians and the environment, that are science-based on the health risk and not influenced by hysteria. The science for this is already well established. I'd really like it to have laypersons, generators, transporters, and disposal facilities to understand what compliance means and how it's demonstrated. And we, as others spoke, we need to allow the generators, transporters, and disposal networks in Oregon to operate without significant disruptions. Thanks, Max, for the time. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Jeff, for being here. Okay, that is, unless there was anybody, unless Shirley or Steve, Reese, or Dorinda, I should go back. Those are the three representatives who were not on the line when I called. If any of them joined since then, Association of Oregon Counties, Dorinda, Oregon State University, Steve Reese, or League of Women Voters of Oregon, Shirley Weathers. I don't see any of them on my list, but I wanted to do one more check. Okay, I don't think they joined. Someone in the chat here, Lizzie Atwood Willis from Association of Oregon Counties. Lizzie, do you speak for AOC on the RAC? I don't know if she can. Chris,
Hey, apologies. This is Lizzie from AOC.
Oh, great. Hi, Lizzie.
I don't have a seat on the rack, though. We might want to talk about that because Drenda's portfolio area covers natural resources, and I cover health and human services, which is probably more in line with this discussion. We work, the counties represent local public health authorities, and we do environmental health work within our local public health authorities. So thanks to everyone for letting me listen in, and I might want to chat with staff after this meeting.
That's great, Lizzie. Thank you for being here. I will note that the appointments to the RAC are by organization. And
Great.
so the organizations are free to appoint their representatives. And so if that's you, welcome. Glad to have you. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Chris and Jeff, that brings us, that's the end of my opening presentations and our first question, our discussions, our introductions, and we are right on schedule. That's great. So next series of presentation, Jeff Burright, my colleague Jeff, is going to deliver some presentation with more information, and then we'll have, as the agenda notes, more discussion with the RAC. So Jeff, take it away.
Did I get disconnected?
Dave, nope, we can hear you. We are just getting the PowerPoint, the next presentation material pulled up here.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Just give us 1 second. Nope. We're doing our best. Hang tight, everybody. Jeff, I see your screen. I think that's your screen, but just your desktop. Oh, Jeff can't unmute himself. Chris, can you unmute Jeff? Is that possible on your end?
Hey, Jeff, try to unmute yourself one more time. I can't do it manually, but I hopefully just unlocked everyone.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Ah,
Yes.
there we go. Sorry,
Yeah.
I lost my controls. I would think I'd be better at this by now. All right, can everyone see my screen and hear me?
We can hear you, but I don't see a presentation. I see your desktop. There you go. Excellent.
You see me now?
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, see the screen. All right. Woo! Good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Burright. I'm the radioactive waste remediation specialist for the department. And my goal here today is to provide kind of a mixture of broad overview and a little bit down in the weeds. I want everyone to have a similar basis of understanding as we get into some of the questions that we're going to ask about these rules, which are fairly detailed and complex. And so what I hope for at the end of this is that I've increased everyone's understanding of the complexity of these rules and of what makes Oregon's definition of radioactive waste different from how other states do it and why that difference is important. To begin with, some relevant units and terms that I'll be talking about through this presentation. I'm not going to go over each one of these, but if you have an offline version of the presentation, you can come back to these at a later time. Okay, as Max mentioned, Senate Bill 246 passed the legislature this year and was signed by Governor Brown and will be in effect starting January 1st. It did a number of things, expanding who may be held responsible to include generators and transporters and those who arrange for disposal of waste contrary to law, as Max said. The second bullet is why we're here today. It enabled the Energy Facility Siting Council to revise the definition of radioactive waste. And
Jeff, I still see, I'm sorry to bother you, Jeff. I still see the definition slide on my screen.
Well, I'm afraid I don't know what to do about that. Is it better yet?
Might be. Oh, there we go. Yes, excellent.
Okay, well, that's fun. We will do our best. Okay. It enables the Energy Facility Siting Council to clarify and update the definition of radioactive waste, which was not possible prior to the bill. As Max said, it also clarifies and strengthens our enforcement authority, as well as authority to recoup costs. See how the lag is doing now. Okay. Can you see the next slide yet?
Not yet. Still on the SB 246 slide.
Boy, okay.
There we go.
Okay, I'm going to stop my own video and maybe that'll help speed things up a little bit. Okay. Let's review the current disposal regulations. In statute, Oregon Statute 469.525, which dates back to the 1970s, prohibits the establishment and operation of any disposal facility for radioactive waste. It's a pretty broad prohibition. However, what quickly came to light was that there were many Oregon industries that produce naturally occurring radioactive material byproducts as byproducts of their industries. And so they went back to the legislature, and there was then the rule set that we're here to talk about today, which the concept being that because virtually everything contains some amount of radioactivity, the line had to be drawn somewhere based on what would present a significant detriment to public health and safety. Out of that effort and that clarification of the legislative intent, we came up with the Division 50 rule set, which defines radioactive waste in a few different ways. You can either have an exempt quantity for the waste, so the total amount, regardless of how concentrated it is, or you can have an exempt concentration, regardless of how much stuff there is. So it's just, if it's lightly radioactive, but there's a lot of it. And then there's this third category of exemption called the pathway exemption. And the idea behind the pathway exemption is to say, beyond how concentrated it is or how much of it you have, let's look at the actual hazard that it would present in the environment and how that would reach a future person and whether that would have a health effect. And so when we say pathway, what we're really talking about is how the waste gets from its disposal context to a future person. And as Max said, there were a series of tests that were developed at that time to be the surrogate for understanding the pathways of waste. Okay, I've changed the next slide. Hopefully it'll be there for you soon. What I'm showing on the slide is the language of Senate Bill 246. There was an amendment to the statute 469.525, which expanded to say not only can you not establish a waste disposal facility for radioactive waste, but you also simply may not dispose of radioactive waste within the state or arrange for it or transport it. The main idea here is that we saw a potential gap here where if someone disposed of waste not in a disposal facility, that might not be covered by the statute. In other words, if it was dumped in a ditch somewhere. So we just wanted to ensure that that was folded into the prohibition in the state. The legislature also, as Max said, directed the Energy Facility Siting Council to adopt standards and rules as necessary to prevent the disposal of radioactive waste within the state. That's slightly different from how we define radioactive waste and gets into more what actions or programs need to be implemented here. It's kind of a secondary consideration for the rulemaking that we're doing here, which is focused on the definition of radioactive waste. So again, the statute itself says you may not dispose of radioactive waste within the state, nor may you establish a waste disposal facility for radioactive waste. The next challenge then is to define what we mean by radioactive waste that is subject to that prohibition. The way it used to be in the statute is that radioactive waste was defined as all material which is discarded, unwanted, or has no present lawful economic use and contains mined or refined naturally occurring radioisotopes. So that's this idea of norm and T-norm that you may have become familiar with over the past few years, as well as byproduct material, source material, kind of the things we tend to think about with radioactive materials and waste. The definition from before specifically cited our Division 50 rules and said the term radioactive waste does not include those materials identified in the administrative rules adopted by the council and revised periodically for the purpose of adding additional isotopes that are not referred to in the Division 50 rules as presenting no significant danger to public health and safety. So there are two important pieces in there. One is this signpost of intent that, you know, we're trying to identify things that present no significant danger to public health and safety and therefore can be exempt from the definition of radioactive waste. The other piece of this was that because the administrative rules were cited in the statute and because the statute said you may not change these rules except to add to them isotopes that you had not previously considered, for many decades now, it had prevented our agency from updating these rules. And so that was something that was remedied in the legislature with the new definition of radioactive waste, which hopefully is showing on the screen now. Has got the slides caught up?
Yes, they have, Jeff. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. So what you see here in the italicized was deleted from the statute, and what was bolded was added to the statute. So deleted the specific reference to the administrative rules, and then brought that essential concept of materials identified by the council as presenting no significant danger to public health and safety. And what this functionally did was allow the rulemaking that we're having here today. So now we're in it. First, I want to show you a taxonomy of what types of materials we are here to talk about. At top level, you have this concept of low-level radioactive materials. High-level radioactive materials are not going to be disposed in this state. I don't think they ever will. That's the kind of stuff that is reserved for a deep geologic repository. So what we're really here to talk about is the everything else category. And you have those human-made radioactive materials that are either generated in a reactor or in a particle accelerator. And that might be what people traditionally think of when they think of radioactive waste. We define those based on their quantities and their concentrations of specific radionuclides. When you get over into the naturally occurring radioactive material, you can have either as in nature, so has not been concentrated by human activity or made more accessible to the public, or you can have something that has been enhanced by some human process. And in either case, they are regulated under our rules. We don't distinguish between the naturally occurring radioactive materials and those that have been technologically enhanced, or TNOR. We regulate them the same as we do currently. And under that framework, you can be exempted from the definition if you have an exempt quantity or concentration of the radioactive material, or if you can pass this pathway exemption that I referred to earlier, the series of tests that are based on the actual hazard that the waste presents in the environment. For those of you who have seen our previous presentations, this again is trying to show the wide range of different types of materials that can contain naturally occurring radioactive material. In Oregon, we often have seen naturally occurring radioactive materials in zircon sands that can be used either for the production of specialty metals within the state, as well as the production of refractory materials, so bricks for kilns kind of thing. You can sometimes even see it in construction materials like gypsum wallboard, sometimes even concrete contains naturally occurring materials at levels that would pique our interest. You can see in the lower left pipes that transport water that has been underground can accumulate pipe scales along the inside. Those pipe scales contain naturally occurring radioactive materials that were deep underground, but were transported by the water and then settled out on the sides of the pipes. And that can be an area where wastes concentrate. And then, people talk about bananas and granite countertops. That naturally occurring radioactive material is in our human environment normally, but there are certain industries that can accumulate and concentrate them. And then in the upper right, what you see there is a collection of filter socks, which have become a problem recently with the expansion of hydraulic fracturing in the oil and gas industry. You're pushing water underground and then to fracture the ground, and then you're bringing that water up and recycling it for reuse in another well. And as you're recycling it, you're filtering out materials which can contain naturally occurring radioactive material that was in the ground. And here on the screen, you can see a figure that illustrates that concept, that you can have naturally occurring radionuclides in the ground that are drawn up from the produced water and then settle out or filter out either in filter socks, in pipes, in tank bottoms. And we have a special focus on this, not only because it was the subject of the violation that occurred in Oregon a couple of years ago now, but also because nationwide, this has become a problem where a lot of this waste is being produced and it's looking for a legal place to be disposed. I'm seeing that there are a couple of comments in chat. Do we need to take a little pause and talk through those, Chris?
Yeah, this is Max, Jeff. Let's see if we can do that real quick. It's like Mason has a couple questions. Mason, can you just speak those in case Jeff has his screen sharing and can't see the chat?
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of curious how we want to deal with, for instance, passive samplers that contain like ion exchange materials that might be used to target a specific analyte and may or may not, depending on pH, et cetera, pick up potential radioactive contaminants from, say, plumes, et cetera. It looks like this slide you're on kind of looks like it might address that through a different setup, but just kind of curious how the disposal of those passive sampling ion exchange based samplers would work, because if norm would be, if there were naturally occurring radioactive materials, or even, for instance, areas that had leaked from plumes around the Hanford site, et cetera, that were soaked up into a passive sampler, if that passive sampler was disposed of in a landfill, would that need to be something that is addressed? Or
my knee-jerk reaction is yes, it would. If it contains concentrations of radionuclides that we have listed in our rules, and we have a wide array, and we can add more if we need to, the intent is to capture any and all radioactive materials that might be disposed in the state, whether it's a norm source or a non-norm source, say if it was cesium or strontium from the Hanford site, as you say. We do have tables in our rules that specify concentrations of those radionuclides. I guess in theory, I'm trying to think if you could subject a non-norm radionuclide to the pathway exemption. You may well be able to, because the pathway exemption is based on, you know, the leachability characteristics, how much gamma it's kicking off, that sort of thing. So I think that our rules as structured can and should address those kinds of wastes.
Right, thanks.
Were there any other questions before we continue on?
I don't see any others in chat. If anybody has something right now while we've taken a pause and wants to speak up, we can. Otherwise, we'll let Jeff continue on.
Okay. I want to get a little bit deeper into this blanket idea of naturally occurring radioactive material and talk about some of the specific radionuclides that are of interest to us. What you see here on the screen is a representation of two different decay chains. So you start on the upper right side of the figure with uranium-238 and thorium-232. Those are the parents. And those parents, as they decay, as they kick off parts of themselves and become something else, they then become daughters. And then those daughters kick off parts of themselves and they become, you know, it's a parent-daughter relation chain that happens all the way down until they finally reach a stable isotope. So in the case of uranium-238, after several billion years, you eventually have lead-206. And with thorium-232, again, after a very long time, you eventually have lead-208. Now, because of this concept of, there's a thing called secular equilibrium, which is maybe getting too into the weeds here, but the idea is that if you wait long enough, that all of these radionuclides would be present in a given waste at the same concentration. So if you have uranium-238 and it's been in the environment for a long time, which it has, and you had 10 picocuries per gram of concentration in the waste of uranium-238, you would also have 10 picocuries of radium-226, which is one that we tend to care about because it has a high gamma, and then it turns into radon, which would also have 10 picocuries per gram. Well, it's a yes. But then you would go down the chain, it would be an equilibrium, so they would all be the same. What we've discovered over the last couple of years is that there are some processes that will preferentially accumulate one radionuclide and not its parents. So you can have these orphan daughters. In the case of the filter socks, the fracking waste, what we found was there was a high concentration of radium-226, but there was almost no uranium-238. Well, how could that be? Well, the radium co-precipitates with barium that was in the subsurface. And so you have the water preferentially removing the daughter, but leaving the parent behind in the ground. And similarly, in natural gas applications, in refinery waste, we can sometimes see high concentrations of lead-210, which you can see kind of down towards the bottom left. It's almost near the end of the chain. You can see high concentrations of that in the waste with very little radium-226 or uranium-238. And it's something that we identified in our rules as potentially needing some clarification, because our concentration tables talk only about the parent all the way at the top, say, uranium-238. And there's this assumption that they're in equilibrium, and that if you're okay on the parent, if you're below your concentration of concern for the parent, that accounts for the daughters. But What we're finding is that there are several wastes out there for which that is really just not the case, that you can have these large concentrations of daughters. And the different isotopes have different reasons to be concerned about them. You know, some of them, if you see an orange arrow on the screen, they can emit gamma radiation, which is like a invisible sunburn, if you will, where it can go through the air to reach your body and irradiate you externally. Whereas there are others that kick off an alpha particle, and that really is only an issue if it's inside your body. So you had to ingest something or inhale something that then turned into an alpha emitting particle in order to cause a health effect. And so understanding the parents and daughters is an important part of understanding the risk in these pathway exemptions that we provide. Here's a list from just experience and research of different types of common industries that can produce T-norm. It's not to say that they all do or that they all do above our levels of concern, but you can see here that there's a pretty wide array of different industries and processes, everything from oil and gas exploration, like we've talked about, to geothermal power production, which it also filters water from underground. And so it's actually very similar to the waste from fracking from a radiological standpoint. I mentioned metal processing and refining, that these zircon sands can contain naturally occurring uranium and thorium. Glass and metals casting, because of the bricks that get made that contain natural zircons. Wastewater treatment plants, you have a similar issue where pipe scales and sludges can build up that potentially can contain norm, depending on the geology of that area. You can have hazardous waste cleanups, so previous disposals where maybe they wanted to get out of a municipal landfill and put it into a hazardous landfill, and it contains some norm wastes, and so we need to think about that. I've seen some research that some pulp and paper mills, again, depending on the geology of the region, can have pipe scales and sludge that contain norm and T-norm. Uranium mining and mill tailings, we do have an old uranium mine down in Southeast Oregon, as well as coal combustion residuals can contain norm and T-norm. There's an asterisk there because our rules specifically exempt the storage of those where they were generated. As I mentioned before, some building materials like gypsum, bricks, granite counters, cement, also sandblast media, because the sandblast stuff that you think to your paper that you're blasting something with can contain natural uranium and thorium in it, and then or it can even remove natural uranium and thorium from whatever it is sandblasting, and you could potentially have an accumulation there. So when we think about what all these rules could affect, it's important to keep all this in mind. I wanted to point out that we are not alone in taking a fresh look at how we regulate norm and T-norm specifically. In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been half a dozen states that have implemented rulemakings to define what are acceptable levels, so concentrations of norm and T-norm in landfills, as well as establishing regimes for how to permit a landfill to become a norm or T-norm landfill. And I mentioned that because that's something that makes Oregon unique in the way that our statute is framed and structured. So as you saw in the statute, Oregon said very plainly, thou shalt not establish a disposal facility for radioactive waste. And so for us, the difficulty is then defining what we mean by radioactive waste. However, the rulemakings that have happened in other states so far have been under the premise that the disposal of radioactive waste is permissible if you can do it safely and if you do it in a manner that the state explicitly allows. So in other words, you get a permit to have a disposal facility say, yes, we will accept T-norm, and we will cap the amount that we allow at 50 picocuries per gram, let's say. And we're basing that decision on a study that looked at the various ways in which the landfill itself will provide safety. for the long term. And if you look at what commonly the safety features of a landfill might be, you could have something like a liner on the underside of a landfill that if the waste would leach materials in the presence of rainwater or any kind of water intrusion, you have a liner that captures that and prevents it from getting to the environment and to the public for some amount of time. For something that kicks off gamma radiation, simply having a few feet of dirt between you and that waste provides enough shielding that the dose at the surface to a person walking on a landfill, or even if they lived there someday, can provide adequate shielding, not only to prevent any radiation from gamma material, but also if for norm, it emits radon gas, which is something that we control in our homes in many regions of the United States, is a concern with norm material. If the waste is buried deeply enough, then that radon gets trapped in the subsurface of the landfill and doesn't actually make it up to the surface in appreciable amounts. So there are other states that say, let's take credit for the ways in which our landfills are, I won't say naturally, are designed to be protective from radioactive waste. Oregon doesn't do that. Oregon says you can't establish a radioactive waste disposal facility, and therefore the waste that you put in a landfill itself has to be so benign that you could spread it on your backyard and build a house on it. And you have to ensure that people would not be exposed to gamma radiation above a level that would cause a health effect. You have to ensure that as rain is falling on the waste, that it's not leaching out contaminants that get into the environment. And our rules also currently require someone to assume that you've built a house on top of that waste and that radon is produced by that waste and finds its way into the house. And then we have a model that looks at what that concentration would be. So this one slide, I think, is maybe the most important one for helping understand what makes Oregon's rules unique. And also when we talk about, being consistent with other states or keeping pace with other states, that this is a complicating factor because we can't simply say, well, let's just do what other states are doing, because we have this fundamental difference in how our statute is constructed. So now I want to dive a little deeper into how exempt norm is defined now in the rule. So exempt means that the norm does not qualify as radioactive waste, period. From the state's perspective, it's not radioactive waste and may be disposed anywhere. And a landfill is not assumed. So in theory, at least the way it used to be, someone could have spread it on the land. We have quantity and concentration thresholds for uranium, thorium, and radium. The threshold concentration for radium-226, which is kind of our tracer here, is 5 picocuries per gram. So 5 is pretty consistent as the low number for other states in the US that set a low number. However, if you have a waste that contains greater than 5 picocuries per gram, there is potentially a way that could be disposed of in the state, and that's this pathway exemption. And it has 3 different tests. External gamma, which is, like I said, kind of like an invisible sunburn, and it's based on a dose to a person. So how much radioactivity or how much radiation would they have received in their body, assuming that they live on the waste site. As I mentioned, leachability to water. And this one has a dose basis as well, but its dose basis is much smaller. It's 25 millirem per year. And then we have a radon-specific value, which really is the concern when we're talking about airborne emissions for norm, based on 3 picocuries per liter in a house that's built on top of the waste. So in each one of these tests, the gamma pathway is based on direct emission from the waste, 500 millirem per year to a future individual. We assume that the waste is not diluted, so you can't mix in this radioactive material with non-radioactive material to lower its concentrations. You have to assume that at the moment you take it out of its equipment, the moment it becomes waste. As I mentioned, it does not consider the effects of land use restriction or cover material. So you don't get to assume that you've put 3 feet of dirt over it. It allows consideration of an annual solid waste stream. So there's a little bit of averaging that could occur when you're talking about large amounts that are generated. And there's an interpretive rule in our rule set based on a numerical model of a house to say, all right, you have a particular waste, rather than perform a model of spreading it out and building a house on it. There was a numerical model done back in the 80s, I believe, that said, if you put that waste in a barrel and you measure it with a handheld meter, as long as you are below 18 micro R per hour at 1 foot away, that corresponds to this 500 millirem a year performance standard. And the purpose here is to make it field implementable. So rather than having to do all these extra steps of modeling and laboratory analysis, have someone be able to go out with a meter and demonstrate that they're complying with the rule. Next is the water pathway, this leachability idea. Leachate concentrations may not exceed 5% of values that are in table 3 of our rule. Table 3 is based on 500 millirem a year because that was the federal standard in the table. However, we say 5% of that, 25 millirem a year. And 25 millirem a year is important because that is the standard that the NRC uses, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, as well as the Department of Energy, to define when land is suitable for unrestricted use. And so our water leachate performance standard is based on unrestricted use. It also is based on actual measurement from at least four representative samples taken from that waste. And it also allows consideration of the annual average of the waste that you are producing. And this last point, it does not consider the migration potential in the environment. This test is based on what is directly coming out of this waste when you put water on it. It doesn't allow you to say, well, we've buried it and there's a cap, and so it's not actually going to get anywhere to the environment. It doesn't allow you to say, well, it's been disposed in a dry region, and so we just won't get that much rainwater. We don't allow for that kind of consideration in context of where it's been disposed. Again, it's based on the waste itself. And then finally, the third test is the air pathway test, but really what we're talking about is radon more often than not. The concentration standard is 3 picocuries per liter of air in a house. And for reference, the EPA action level for radon in a home is 4 picocuries per liter. So if you're above 4 peaks per liter, that's when you tend to have mitigation built into your home, like a fan that's blowing air out. Our rule requires that this be demonstrated based on experimentally measured radon emanation rate of the waste. What you see on the right is a picture of what we dub the aquarium test, where there's a radon meter in the aquarium and it's air sealed. You put the waste in there, you count how much radon is generated, and then based on this measurement inside the box, you can extrapolate that to a model of a house that was developed in the 80s to then determine whether or not this waste would pass our pathway test. One of the big reasons why I think we're here today to talk about the pathway exemption and our definition is that when the pathway exemption was developed in the 80s, at that time, the public dose limit for radioactive exposure was 500 millirem per year. Over time, that public dose limit has dialed down. And today, the annual public dose limit is 100 millirem per year. As I mentioned just a minute ago, though, there are other standards out there that could potentially be used as the applicable health standard. For example, 25 millirem per year, as I mentioned, is the criteria for when a piece of land can be released for unrestricted use per the NRC. It's also used by the EPA for the allowable dose from an operating nuclear power plant. You could dial it even lower, though. The Superfund law, CERCLA, sets a risk-based limit, not a dose-based limit. So you have to keep the risk after you've cleaned up a site to a range in between 1 in a million and 1 in 10,000 fatal cancers as a result of the waste left behind. So a 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 6 risk. The EPA came out with some guidance that equated the upper level of that, the 10 to the minus 4, 1 in 10,000, with 12 millirem a year. And so you have what I consider to be some disharmony at the federal level about what level we're actually going for. You have 100, you have 25, you have 12. And then over here on the left, you see that from our perspective, when you consider the gamma radiation, 500 millirem is our standard. When you consider the leachability in water, though, 25 is our standard, and then radon kind of gets its own category based on the action levels. And so I think that there's a potential here for us to talk about whether the dose limits in our rule are applicable or appropriate to the different standards that are out there. Oh, and I'll mention that while our gamma pathway test is based on 500 millirem a year, that could potentially cause a problem if you were land spreading this waste and you were actually going to be building houses on it. But the reality of the pathway exemptions that the state has provided to date are that all of the waste have been disposed in landfills. And so while we don't allow you to take credit for the land cover that goes over these wastes, in reality, there is land cover over these wastes. And so even if we're exempting something based on 500 millirem a year of gamma, and that may not be consistent with the federal standards, if you were to consider that waste in the context of its actual disposal, your gamma actual dose to a person would likely be far, far lower. And so I think that we are complying with the federal standards today, so long as you assume that it's disposed in landfill and you're taking some credit for that. Here shows some data from what some other states are setting as limits. And again, they tend to focus on radium-226. Some other states are also starting to focus on lead-210 as another constituent of concern, and polonium-210, its daughter. But many states set a default limit of 5. However, there are some states that are setting standards of 30 when it's related to land spreading or a policy, or if it's a special waste like drinking water treatment sludge, because that's a problem for multiple municipalities. There are some states that set disposal limits of 50 picocuries per gram, but only in a licensed landfill with certain provisions in there, like it must be buried at least 10 feet deep, that kind of thing. Whereas these ones where you see very high disposal limits, those are specific to a specialized landfill that has these various protective measures. And so they allow high concentrations in there. But I don't think that's really applicable to the Oregon situation. So as you can see, there's kind of a wide spread. I'm getting towards the end here, and I want to prime the pump for this Rulemaking Advisory Committee and talk about some of the questions that we talk about in the office when we think about where this rulemaking could potentially go, or some of the questions where we're really looking for outside perspectives. The first question is the most basic. Is the pathway exemption framework that we use in Oregon, that is unique to Oregon, still necessary and protective? And what would the alternative be? There is a alternative future where the pathway exemption goes away and we just default to 5 picocuries per gram like some other states do. And the result of that would be that there would be waste generated both in state and waste that are disposed in state that would then have to go to other facilities in other states. But it's one way we could go. Another way we could go is we keep the pathway exemption. However, we then ask ourselves, beyond those 3 tests, are there pathways that are missing? For example, plant uptake through root systems and on leaves is something that is now included in radiation dose modeling that wasn't at the time when the pathway exemption was developed. And is it appropriate to include something like that? And again, the complication comes in that if in reality this waste is buried very deep, is that a plausible scenario? But then again, you can't take credit for land cover. So there's a bit of a predicament there, a paradox. Another question, currently in the rule, there is a requirement that once something is determined to be radioactive waste, it must be disposed out of the state within 7 days. What we've found in practice is that sometimes it just takes longer to arrange all the pieces to get that waste out of state. And so we are wondering if there are ways to make that different, if there are good faith efforts being taken to get the waste off site, as quickly as feasible. As I've alluded to, we have this 500 millirem dose standard for the gamma portion of the rule. And I would like to understand the RAC's perspective on whether that rule and that standard is appropriate or whether it should be different. As I also kind of talked about what makes Oregon different from other states, we also should revisit the question of, should there be any protection assumed when a waste is disposed normally in an existing landfill? So should you be allowed to take credit for disposing of something and covering it with dirt cover if that was something that was already going to be done to it? Or does that violate the intent of the statute? Is the evaluated period of waste generation appropriate? In some parts of the rule, it says the annual average waste stream. In other parts of the rule, it talks about considering the projected period of waste generation. And the reason this matters is how you might average out. If you get one hot load of waste from a generator that generates a large amount of waste, and most of the waste they generate is much lower, there is currently a provision to allow consideration of that annual average, and we're looking for some feedback there. The next question, is accumulation of norm in landfills adequately accounted for? So right now, our pathway exemption is specific to each individual waste stream from a single generator. However, if you're a landfill, you could potentially be accepting waste from multiple waste streams from multiple generators. And we just want to get the RAC's perspective on whether there need to be any additional standards or rules associated with these kind of accumulation points in landfills to ensure that they don't accidentally become a radioactive waste disposal facility. And then how to account for waste disposed under a previously approved pathway exemption. This relates to the idea of if you have something that has been allowed in the rule for the last couple of decades, and then we change the rule, what is the most appropriate way to deal with that situation? Next questions. Should there be any new exemptions for certain waste forms or types? And I know this is something that Dave Smith has talked to me about in the past, where if you have certain things like a certain type of brick that we know based on its properties just doesn't emit radon and doesn't leach to water, are there ways to exempt certain types of materials because we know enough about them today to say you don't have to do the 3 tests every time? Or is that not appropriate? Are there out of equilibrium wastes that are appropriately analyzed in the current rule? Well, this gets to that idea of parents versus daughters, where if you're doing a leachability test on a waste that, well, let me see. We'll come back to that one at a different time. I don't want to get too deep into it. Are there circumstances when waste blending may be allowed? So if you have, a small quantity of waste that is 100 picocuries per gram, are there ever any circumstances where it's acceptable to blend that in with a large amount of waste that is very low in radioactivity to then result in an average waste that would meet our standards, or do we not allow any of that ever? Are doses to landfill workers adequately controlled by the standards? And an interesting piece of the recent rulemakings that have happened in other states that set limits at 50 picocuries per gram for their landfills is that 50 picocurie per gram limit was not based on the waste in the ground potentially becoming encountered by a future resident in a house. It was based on limiting the potential exposure to landfill workers if a large quantity of waste was coming in every year. And so we need to, I think, look at whether our rules are assumed to be protected there. We want to understand kind of some of these questions I heard or interests I heard early on today about how to ensure that that compliance is being followed. You know, are there any verification or recertifications that should be specifically called out in the rule to have some sort of regular check-in on a waste that has been exempted? Should there be any specific tracking or reporting requirements for an in-state exempted norm disposal? So the state has said this is not radioactive waste per our perspective. Do we still need to track where it goes and how much, et cetera? Similarly, if the state says we do call this radioactive waste, you must dispose of it out of state, what tracking reporting requirements would be required there? And then the last bullet is kind of a catch-all. Are there any additional standards or rules necessary to prevent disposal of radioactive waste in Oregon? That was a lot of detail. I hope I was successful in communicating how complex this is and how different things are in Oregon. Are there any questions about what I've presented so far before we get into our RAC discussion?
It looks like Wayne had a question in the chat. In Southeast Oregon, there are mineable uranium deposits. What are the exposure rates in this area, and are there any folks living on or nearby that site?
Yeah, I see that question. Thanks, Chris. This is Max. Let's see. There are two former uranium mines in Lake County. I'm not sure if this is what Wayne is referring to. There are two former uranium mines that were operated in the late 50s, early 60s for a very brief period of time. Both of those former mines are near the town of Lakeview, sort of southern part of Lake County. We actually monitor, along with partner agencies at DEQ, EPA, U.S. Forest Service, there's land, the Forest Service land. There's other agencies involved that help us monitor the former uranium mine tailing sites, as well as there's a former uranium mill site that was taken apart, dismantled from Lakeview, moved into another location, into a centralized disposal site, and then covered up. Tom Cecilia of our team actually is our designated representative to those mine sites. And we do some regular monitoring with our state and federal partner agencies. I'm not aware of anybody living close to any of those locations, either the mines or they call it the UMPTRA. It's an acronym for the uranium mill site that's been landfilled. So I don't know, but it's worth considering, sort of, as we think about the background. And maybe your question is more broader, just about background radiation that people in certain parts of our state are exposed to, which is naturally occurring from just sources in the earth. That might be something to contemplate and discuss.
Yeah, the mines themselves are in national forest, so there's no residents nearby. But one thing to note, we don't regulate bedrock. Until it gets ored or mined or dug up and made more readily available to exposure, that's when it becomes sort of norm or T-norm. That's the distinction. If it's in place naturally, it's not regulated.
Thanks, Tom. Charlotte, I see you have a question.
Thank you. So I presume the list of questions, which is quite a list of discussion items, those are the things that you're talking about over the course of the rulemaking. Those aren't questions you're digging into today.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah.
So I would just say that I do think, just because of the highly technical nature of this rulemaking, and I participate primarily on rulemakings at DEQ, but just that these kinds of slides get out in advance to the participants, because when you are, I just looking at the list of folks on the RAC, pretty much everybody here represents somebody else. We're not just free agents speaking for, kind of shooting from the hip. So to the extent that those slides can go out in advance, so we know what those questions are going to be. And again, maybe that's not an issue for today and you're just sticking to the agenda questions, but just looking at those, those are a lot of discussions that I would need to have with my members in advance. So just a heads up there.
Yeah, very much. Thanks, Charlotte. I appreciate it. Agreed. This information, the slides are now on the website. We posted them. The intention was not to get into those questions today, but like you mentioned, like confirmed, the intention is that those are questions that I think Jeff mentioned at the beginning of his discussion on that slide. Those are the questions that we discuss internally right now as we've been thinking about the rule set and how they're applied currently, and what the rulemaking process might look into, major issues we would like to get into, with the idea that those questions will be discussed at coming meetings. And frankly, each one of those questions in itself is worthy of a discussion, as well as, of course, questions that we haven't even brought up yet that the RAC will bring, of course, to the table there. So the intention wasn't that those would be discussed right now. It was simply a series of questions that we're forecasting will be debated over the RAC.
Thank you. Well, that is what I assumed. It's just that when I was looking through those, I went, this kind of underscores the need to, get materials in advance. So I just thought I would raise that issue, because those are pretty, a lot of things to ponder in each of those. So appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So if there's any other questions, if there's no other questions right now for Jeff and his information, we are at time for a quick break, and then we'll come back and dive into the questions that we posed in the agenda, the 3 RAC discussion questions. Should we take, Chris, what do you think, a 10-minute break till 10:50?
Well, I was going to suggest maybe we take a shorter break, like maybe 5 minutes to give plenty of time for the discussion in the end, but I think that depends on whether that's enough for the RAC members.
5-minute break. Is that, anybody have any opposition to a quick 5-minute break? Come back at 10:45. All right. Thumbs up from Damon. We'll do it. Thanks, everybody. We'll take a quick break and then come back in about 5 minutes and dive into the rest.
Great. And I'm going to pause the recording while we're on break.
I do, thanks. I just another process issue, and again, I'm just mostly used to DEQ's process, and so I'm not familiar with. So it might be helpful to kind of just talk a little bit about what how ODO handles process questions. We're going to dive into some of the questions that are on the agenda, and I suspect that that's going to be a lot of material potentially from each participant. And do you normally take comments after RAC meetings? How is that sort of thing communicated to ODO staff?
Thanks, that's a good question. Chris, do you have more of a process response to that?
Well, I believe, Charlotte, if you're asking if, after today's discussion, if RAC members can provide us additional materials in writing, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, I'm just, if things aren't, rather than reading a lot of or going through a lot of, heavy material, it might be appropriate to submit some of that. I don't know, just for the record. And DEQ would normally post that on to accept comments following RAC meetings, and then that would be posted so that it's public information and people can see it.
Yeah, generally we do the same thing. We would accept any written materials that people want to submit after the RAC, and depending on the nature of those materials, we would plan on posting them, and they, of course, all be part of the public records. At the kind of timing of posting varies from RAC to RAC, but we would also generally, make sure all those materials are provided to the Energy Facility Siting Council as part of the meeting when they review the record and our recommendations for proposed rules later in the process.
Okay, and then what time frame would you want to receive any additional materials in?
I'll actually defer to Max and Jeff on that.
Yeah, I guess I would, well, we're thinking the next, and this is on the agenda, we're thinking the next RAC meeting will be 4 to 6 weeks from now. And that timeline is what we think is necessary for us to really assess and process the information we get today. Plus any information, as you mentioned, Charlotte, that might come in written form from the RAC members. You know, within 2-3 weeks after this meeting would probably be helpful, but I wouldn't put a firm deadline on it. I mean, as we get closer to the next meeting schedule, as we build the agenda, as we look at the topics we want to talk about, of course, having that material, you know, sooner rather than later helps us build that list of questions to go through and builds our, you know, future presentation for the next RAC meeting. But if you have something that, you know, you really want to respond to and you'd say, you know what, it's just going to take us a couple of weeks to get it pulled together, you know, we can be flexible. It's just really a matter of how that value for the next meeting or perhaps future meetings kind of comes into play, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, that's totally fair. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Max, can I add just a little bit?
Please.
So I know we did put a lot of questions out there that are kind of the food for thought questions. When we're generating those questions, I think the intent is to carve those out and have some specific conversation topics in future meetings to actually dive into those issues. And so the intent was not to trigger this, oh my goodness, I have to come up with a response to all of these questions here as soon as possible. It's really to just get us to start thinking about these questions that are coming down the pike, and then we can design where in the process we want to talk about them, give people enough time to develop their thoughts on specific topics.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That's great. Charlotte, since you mentioned it, maybe just a reminder for everybody, anything you do submit to us is a public record, whether you intend it to be shared with the RAC or not, it does become a public record, so keep that in mind. Yeah, and I see your chat. Thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, for sure. Recognizing that the sooner the material's out to the members for digestion ahead of the meeting is, yes, important. Agreed. Okay, so for the next agenda, really the next hour of the meeting, we have the 3 questions that are posed in the agenda. I think we have those on a slide that we can pull up. Jeff, is that right? Great, I see that on my screen. And the idea here, in order to, I don't necessarily want to call, or we don't want to call everybody and just, you know, make it feel like it's a school classroom going around. We were thinking that we would have just the popcorn, shall we say, the response to discussion questions 1, 2, 3 by RAC members as you see fit, and just really open it up for dialogue and discussion. If that seems a little too unwieldy, we could always call on people, but I'd like to try and have a little more organic discussion. We've as staff have been talking to you for most of the morning here and would like to get more direct dialogue and conversation from the RAC members. So really the 3 questions posed up here on the screen, the same questions that were in the agenda. The first question, pretty broad. Second question, only a little more specific. And then of course, the third question is looking towards the future as we think about future RAC meetings. And the second part of question 3 is really for RAC members, if you would like to have a slot to give a presentation on your perspective or a particular issue at a future RAC meeting, let us know and we can make that happen. Chris, Jeff, anything else to add to that? Okay. Well, why don't we just see if we can dive in and see if there's any party souls who are willing to be the first person to jump in and open the conversation.
Hey, Max, Jeff, Tom, Chris. I think Jeff explained it really well, what the intent of the rule is, and there are exceptions to that rule. I guess, because I represent a disposal facility, question 2 is probably the most germane to me. I think that, it is important that we recognize, the risk, right, that's associated with where we put waste. Right now, the risks are recognized based on, for lack of a better term, land applying those and allowing people to build houses on them. I think there is room for recognition of landfills as being a safe place for these materials that are naturally occurring. As you said, you gave a good list of what we found in the last 2 years to be possible candidates for issues. Again, back to my original comment on the first question, it really needs to be science based and based on risk, all right, depending on what we're doing and where we're at. So, and then question 3, I don't have a presentation I want to give. I think there might be one other topic that we want to kind of talk about, and it's really the basis for how we measure isotopes. We have laboratory analysis of isotopes, but at the levels that we're trying to measure them, it's difficult to measure them with respect to certain things in a timely manner. 21 days to figure out what a waste might be for our disposal networks and our generators is a problem. So, what I've seen is are there better measurement techniques for things that don't take 21 days? What is that? Because that's really the basis. I mean, for us to decide what concentration triggers it being radioactive or requiring a pathway exemption, we need to be able to measure those isotopes. So that would be my 2 cents.
Thank you, Jim. Great. Wayne, I see you have a raised hand.
Yeah. Hey, so in so many words right now, we don't allow in this state the disposal of radioactive waste and in a central location. And just hear me out and then correct me, see if I misunderstood. In a centralized location, but depending on how we define that waste or that material or both, if it meets a criteria or criterion rather, we're allowed to actually do other things with it in the state, but not put it in one spot as a disposal mechanism. Do I hear that right? Just roughly at this point.
Let me see if I understood it. Radioactive waste is not allowed to be disposed in Oregon, right?
Right.
What's defined, how we define radioactive waste? I mean, that's the question, right? The statute directs the Energy Society Council to make that definition by rule, which they've done, and we're thinking about that today. And current rule does not allow for the as Jeff mentioned, the mitigating effects of a landfill to be considered in how radioactive waste is defined, or really, I mean, it really doesn't play into that discussion at all. So the waste has to be assessed based on its characteristics as it exists, as it comes out of the waste generating facility.
Max, if I can add a little bit of, I guess, direct examples or some context. In the back in the 80s, there was a radioactive waste question about some sludge retention ponds at a facility in Oregon. And it was a question to determine whether the norm leftovers at the bottom of those ponds constituted radioactive waste that needed to be disposed out of state. And the presumed alternative, if it was determined that they were not radioactive waste, was that there was no requirement that anything actually be done with them. In other words, it would kind of constitute a just leaving it where it's at. So you're not assuming that it's in a landfill, for instance. And maybe that's kind of what you're getting at, this idea that there are things that could be left on the land, not in a landfill, as well as things that are disposed in a landfill.
Well, yeah, up to a point, but the average energy for radium-226 is about 600 keV, photon. It's pretty penetrating, and that's why you worry about it, right? Cesium-137, which is a fission product, has about the same energy, a little bit more energetic, but not much. And so it always kind of baffled me how your cells don't recognize the difference between those two energies. And if we ended up saying, well, one is radioactive and doesn't belong in the state at all, it's a fission product and needs to go somewhere else, out of the state, but the other we can leave here, and not only that, we can maybe spread it around on the ground and things like that. That gets back to the original question that I posed on in the chat there, which is, at that point, it becomes very relevant about what ambient background looks like in the state. Not every state has high levels of concentrations of uranium or thorium necessarily, but if you do, then that's there's this kind of continuum about what is what native background looks like at that point, because you kind of have to compare it to that if you're going to do a risk assessment to begin with, because that becomes the baseline of, well, if you were near any of those mines and you live there, are you more at risk? Because it's all natural anyway, and and the whole planet is essentially radioactive, and so you can't really hide from it necessarily. So what are the risks that we're really concerned about there? That's so. And sorry, forgive this is probably very clear in your minds, but it becomes less clear for me when we sit here and think about what is radioactive and what isn't, and the mechanisms you have to go through there to determine if it's a waste product or not. And I also think too here that the exempt quantities that we're talking about for like medical applications, therapeutic, diagnostic, that kind of thing, they must surely be exempt. I'll just make that assumption here, but correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
I got to check the medical waste, Wayne, but I will say that our gamma pathway rule accounts for the dose rate above the background. So we're really defining the waste as the additional radioactivity above background.
That helps. Yeah, thanks.
I can address a question. Medical waste is not really what we're talking about. It wouldn't be in this category for waste. So if it's less than 120 days, they're allowed to store it on site for decay until basically it doesn't exist anymore, and then they can dispose of it because it's gone. If it's over 120 days for a half-life, then they have to go through other pathways. And most medical isotopes that we use don't have that, because most facilities don't want to have to figure out a new pathway for their medical waste disposal. So that one we do keep track of pretty clearly. Where the confusion comes is really norm and T-norm. And it from a regulated use perspective, and Jeff already spoke about this a little bit in his talk. Our federal partners, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, don't regulate norm. And so most states have just been developing this themselves. And when I do reach out to the NRC for questions about these things, they're like, well, we don't regulate. So, but they point me at other states to help us out. And so medical waste wouldn't be an issue for waste disposal, because we do track that from because that's a regulated use. Most of the stuff that's here is stuff that got unintentionally disposed by people who likely don't have licenses or people who are out of state. So that helps kind of clear stuff up, hopefully.
That's very helpful, and I think we should emphasize that unintentionality part of it, because I think what stimulated the whole thing was the dumping over at in Gillum County, right at Arlington. So and by the way, for those of you who hadn't had a chance to actually look at Jeff's really wonderful presentation in front of that committee, I forgot the name of the committee, but it was chaired by Representative Breyer. It is very enlightening. Highly recommend take a look at that. It's worth the, I don't know, half hour, maybe 20 minutes that he spent doing it. It's very, very helpful. So anyway, thank you. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Wayne. The statute or ORS 469525 has some exemptions for medical waste, and that exemption has been adopted in the current rule set as well. I would anticipate bringing that over, but perhaps worthy of discussion in a future RAC meeting. Charlotte, is your hand raised from the previous question, or do you have something else to add?
Apologies, it was still raised. I can go anytime. I just was trying not to, hog the stage here, but whenever, if somebody else wants to go before me, that's fine too, but apologies, I forgot to put my hand down.
Why don't you dive in if you like to go? I saw you up in the queue there.
Okay, well, I'm looking really at question 1 to start with. Related to the intent of ORS 469-525, it was really to prevent Oregon from becoming a dumping ground for radioactive waste, understanding that it could potentially be dangerous to public health and safety. And radioactive waste, I think it's the issue has been raised here, that it's tricky to define. I mean, the fact is that radioactivity isn't just in materials from Hanford or other nuclear facilities. Radioactivity is all around us, and in many naturally occurring materials. And many of those materials have low radioactivity and are not a threat to public health and safety. So we are hopeful that the ODO rulemaking will reaffirm the pathway exemption, and other exempt materials don't present a significant danger to public health and safety, and that no significant revisions are revisions which set out the pathway exemption. I won't cite all of the sections of the OARs. That there aren't any significant revisions that are needed. So I think the caveat for no significant revisions is that several of the annual doses and exposure rate limits are fairly arbitrary and need to be revisited and updated in order to be based in science. I could spend quite a while talking about what all of those details are, but that might be something that would be more appropriately submitted in writing rather than for people with all of the regulations. But the key point is really that norm and T-norm waste are generally not considered radioactive waste, and provided it can be demonstrated that public health and safety are protected, should be disposable in the state of Oregon through a pathway exemption. So that is on that issue. I was going to see if there was anything else. Let's see. So specific topics. The only thing I was going to say about the procedural question related to, I guess it's the second question under 3. In terms of presentations, I don't think we need to request a specific presentation, and I think these exchanges are far better if people are just engaging appropriately and not we don't necessarily need to take the stage, but depending on what might unfold. I guess we reserve the right, but would rather just engage in a conversation here. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, understood. I saw Dave with his hand raised, and then Damon. So Dave, why don't you go now? Dave, you're on mute. What was it? *6 should unmute you. All right, try it now. You look like you're unmuted on my screen here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we are.
All right. Okay. First of all, it's probably useful for me to make a couple of things clear. I think Chris began the introductory phase of this meeting pointing out that most of the members are here to represent other organizations. That is not true of me. I'm involved in this because I've been talking to Odo staff about this issue on and off since I retired from Odo in 2005. So I think you will find that I will play something of a role of historian. I began working for the Health Division, which is now the Oregon Health Authority Radiation Protection Group, in mid-1974. And I went to the Department of Energy in 1985. So I will probably play a little bit of a historical role. But I'm representing myself, not an organization. As far as question number one, what's the intent of 469-525? The original intent, this was initiative petition past statutes. It was ballot measure 9 in 1984. And it had to do, I think Jeff mentioned the sludge wastes, accumulated sludge wastes. It had to do with those wastes. And so the discussion, the public discussion upon which the voters made their decision was generally not, we got to keep Oregon from becoming a dumping ground for other states. It was had to do with wastes that were already here, and that's what the discussion was. And with respect to those wastes, I guess one of the questions or one of the observations I would make is those sludge wastes were found by the council to meet the pathway exemption and therefore were not radioactive waste under Oregon law. And that was a contested case proceedings. I was the Odo staff person that worked on writing the administrative order for the council. And I think it's important to note, especially with respect to the question of land application versus land filling, and should there be a difference, those sludge wastes, prior to all of us getting involved at the Health Authority and at the Department of Energy in the late 70s and early 80s, those sludge wastes were licensed by the Oregon Department of Agriculture to be used in land application for a soil amendment, because they are chemically, they are primarily calcium sulfate or byproduct gypsum. Now, however, the 10 acres in the city of Millersburg, on which that sludge was applied, has been restricted at the request of then Oregon's public health officer, so that it would never be used for residential construction. Because even though it met the pathway exemption, there's enough radium-226 in that sludge that building a house on top of it would or could pose a problem to radon accumulation in those homes. So had that material been disposed in a landfill, and eventually it was, once it was found to be non-radioactive waste under Oregon law, the company chose to dispose of it in an industrial waste landfill at Arlington. So Arlington has been involved with some of this material for quite a while. And I think that was an appropriate thing to have done. Spreading it on more land would have been a problem. And they chose to dispose of it in it wasn't, I don't believe it was in the hazardous waste landfill. I think it was in more of an industrial waste landfill. But it was virtually RCRA compliant. It had leachate collection and monitoring systems and all of that. So it was, you know, how that ended up worked out, I think, pretty well. So the original intent of 469-525 had to do with in-state waste. There was no pressure at that time for Oregon to be a place where other states would send something, primarily because the state of Washington hosts a regional low-level radioactive waste disposal site on the Hanford Reservation. So it's never really been a question for Oregon to, you know, commercially try and get into that business. So that's sort of my way of addressing question number 2, is do I think differently about disposal in a landfill versus disposal in other contexts, such as spreading on land? Yes, I do. And we have a historical example of where land application, even though it was found to be under the pathway rules, it was found to be non-radioactive waste, still now requires a land restriction so that it can, in Lynn County's land use plan, I believe that land is called out for farm use only. It cannot be developed into housing stock. Let's see, question number 3, specific issues well, I mean, I will put those down in writing because I think there are some important questions. You know, one of the ones that sort of came to mind as Jeff was talking is the population dose limits. At the time the original rules were put in place was 500 milligram a year, and that's been changed to 100. But what's important is that's a population dose. It was never designed to be a dose to a specific individual under a specific set of circumstances. And to try and translate it that way is difficult. Unfortunately, the original rules, including the gamma pathway in the pathway exemptions, did exactly that. And that's where the 18 micro-rem per hour at a foot from a couple of different storage geometries, either a 55-gallon drum or a box, that's where that comes from, and I'm the author of that rule. But I was, the 500 millirem a year was served up. It was that was existing law, and that's what we had to deal with. If we went down the road of saying, well, it was 500 and it's now 100, so we need to divide that by 5, you literally take the 18 microar per hour and get down closer to 3 microar per hour, which is actually less than background radiation in most places in Oregon. So trying to translate a population dose to a specific application like that, it's going to have some real problems if you try and do it as simply as that. And I don't think Jeff was suggesting that, but it's clearly something that could come up. And I just want to let you folks know that I will be trying as best I can to bring issues like that into our discussion so that hopefully we can understand all of the background, the history of some of these issues, and the ramifications of our decisions. So I appreciate being on the RAC. It's kind of fun to be back in the saddle again. I haven't done an awful lot of radiochemistry in the last 16 years, well, actually for a long, long time, but I really think I have some things I can offer here.
Thanks, Dave.
I'll shut up by now. Say again?
Thanks, Dave. So really appreciate the context here, and glad you're here with us too. Thank you. Damon, I see your hand has been in the queue.
Yeah, thanks so much. I've been really appreciating this session so far, and I really appreciate the thorough context and explanations that we started with, and this chance to talk through these discussion questions. So I think, especially for any members of the public that are calling in here, I really want to encourage folks to read the long form investigative reporting that Justin Noble did for the Rolling Stone in early 2020. Just lifting up what Jeff was talking about in the case study of Gilliam County and the Arlington landfill. I think it's just really helpful to get a better picture, a broader understanding of what it is that we're actually dealing with on just how big the scale of the hydraulic fracturing industry is right now, and how much of a demand there is for places to put those filter socks and other highly concentrated radioactive materials. So to me, that's really kind of one of the most important focus points for this first discussion question here about, like, why is it that we're doing this? What kinds of materials are we intending to prevent from being disposed in Oregon? I think it is really important to kind of keep the eyes on the prize of that as a pretty imminent threat right now, of there being a pretty strong demand for finding places to stick that stuff. As I want to just sort of echo some of what else has been said around discussion question 2 about, what are some of the differences between disposal in a landfill versus disposal in other contexts, such as land spreading. And I actually think that in both of those settings, one of the things that's coming to my mind is cumulative impacts with other types of background radiation and other existing materials that have a high concentration of radioactivity. And so, I would, for example, be concerned about, how are we measuring and understanding what the existing level of radioactive exposure is for, say, a landfill worker, when there's additional materials that are then being added to that landfill. What does it mean when things get more concentrated over time as leachate starts to build up? And particularly, as I think it was Wayne who was saying very, very nicely, what kinds of background exposures do we need to be considering before we would look at something like land spreading, so that we are not, kind of adding to an overall cumulative impact that would be much more detrimental and harmful to health than just sort of the specific chunks of radioactivity that we would be saying doesn't qualify as radioactive waste. So can't think of anything that we would want to present on at this point in time, but I really think that is one of the sort of like issues or topics that is really important to organ physicians for social responsibility, is considering that whole environmental consideration, right? Understanding that communities and public health are impacted by all of the things that are all of the sources of radioactivity that are in their environment. And that we should really be thinking very, very hard about how it is that we are adding to that stacked pool of radioactivity in a given area, and therefore leading to possible detrimental health impacts, even if the small amounts of radioactivity being added to an environment are pretty small and therefore, kind of drop out of this radioactive waste definition. I see somebody in the chat is asking about the Justin Noble piece. I will post a link into the chat for folks to take a look at that.
Great, thanks, Damon. Thank you very much. I have read the Rolling Stone piece. I probably a lot of us have as well. So it's good journalism, shall we say. Jim, you had your hand up and now your hand is down. I don't know if you wanted to respond to something specifically, or if you had another make.
Well, I didn't necessarily want to respond to something, but I did want to first say, Dave Smith, thanks for all your hard work back in the 80s and really trying to make, Oregon and the people and public of Oregon safe from radiation. That was a huge effort when not much was known by these things. And I had a question. Dave, you talked about kind of the exposure portion that Jeff had discussed, and at 500, that's what you had. I think it's important maybe to remember that 500 was a continuous exposure for a certain person, a pregnant woman, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But do you see if there's a differentiation between land disposal, land farming, for lack of a better term, or what happened in Millersburg before it was moved to Arlington? Do you see a differentiation between the exposure levels, maybe on an occupational exposure? The occupational exposure that Jeff showed in his presentation was 5,000, so 10 times that, or 100 times, or whatever the number is. Can't think of it off my head, but that kind of lends back to the question, how do we manage the wastes that are being generated in Oregon as we speak that exceed the concentration limits? They're certainly, historically, they're not being placed back on the land that I'm aware of, but they are being disposed of in, modern Subtitle D or Subtitle C landfills. So I guess that's a long soapbox question for Dave, but is there a differentiation that we should look at between the 500 and the 5,000 based on?
Jim, I think that might be a question for a future RAC meeting in the interest of time today.
Okay, no problem, man.
And otherwise, I think we might run up against our clock here.
You got it.
But it's a good point to raise. And thanks for that. Hillary, you have a hand up.
Yes. So for myself, I'm not very familiar with land spreading, so I want more information on it before we made any determinations on essentially which one is better. And for number 3, one of the things that would be really helpful for radiation protection services and our licensees, and I think and our waste disposal facilities, is really improving on clarifying how to actually dispose of things correctly and safely, in the context of can it be disposed of in Oregon? And then if it can't be disposed of in Oregon, where can they dispose it, and like where can they go to for that? Because it's a very confusing process, even for us as regulators. We go on site, we try to identify it for people, and then we let them know, oh, well, you can call these few people that are available within the state. And there's really only one waste broker on the West Coast. And this ties back to one of the previous talking points for that 7-day disposal period, that if it's not exempt, you have 7 days to get rid of it. That's really not feasible. Like I said, there's one waste broker for the entire West Coast. They come through once a quarter, and expecting facilities to properly bag it, box it up, and get rid of it when they're not allowed to drive radioactive materials because they haven't had training, when they don't likely have training on how to even like handle radioactive materials, and they don't have the protective equipment. So that is definitely an issue that we run into quite a bit when we go out on calls for radioactive waste.
Great, thanks, Hillary. I would note that the question too, you mentioned whether it's preferable for landfill versus land spreading. That really isn't the intention of our question there. I think really the thought exercise around question 2 is, if material is not radioactive waste, if it's defined as not radioactive waste, then ODO doesn't have restrictions that it places upon that waste stream, right? Because it's not radioactive waste, therefore it can be handled, managed, disposed of. There may be other rules, right? DEQ rules, or perhaps even RPS rules that apply, or federal regulations, but not from our perspective. That's sort of the core of that question. And because we know, as they've mentioned, that this has occurred in the past, land spreading of material, that we wanted to raise that question, right? So there's a bit there, but it's not as a value judgment of preference, to be clear. Jamie from DEQ, I see you have a hand up.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to second, I think what Hillary was saying about the confusion of regulators and where the various rules collide, right? So sometimes it can be confusing, and you can be like, oh, call this person and then call that person, and it's difficult to determine who has authority and what is expected, right? And so I think like it would be really great between, and maybe I missed it in some of the handouts, but this is like a wedge, right, of various things, right? So, you know, under Oregon Health Authority, they regulate the medical waste portions. And then, you know, some stuff we won't even see because that is like at a federal, level, like the stuff coming out of nuclear reactors and things like that, right? And so I think it'd be better for us to understand, like, and I think someone else voiced this opinion, that wedge of material that we're really discussing. And then we're talking about liquids and maybe solid spreading on the land versus landfilling. And then, you know, landfills, there's basically 3 different types in Oregon. So understanding the consequences of just saying landfill versus like what Jim was saying, like a subtitle D or RCRA, subtitle C facility. But yeah, I think that would help me a lot, understanding like what's being regulated already by the feds and by the state of Oregon that isn't in the wedge of the materials that are waste that we're specifically talking about. And I apologize if that's already in the materials provided, but I didn't really see like the very, very specific things we're talking about. And that, you know, we may not know what we don't know, right? But yeah, that's what I've been thinking about. And I also want to say I was super excited to be here, and this is my first RAC, and yay, this is super interesting. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. To respond just a little bit, thank you for the questions, good points. You know, I've been on the job, my current position, a little more than a year now, and as my own personal professional knowledge has come up to speed, I've kind of looked at the Oregon state regulatory agencies between RPS, between DEQ, and between my group and ODO. It's almost like this 3-circle Venn diagram. Maybe it's not overlapping as much as I think it might does, but meaning if it's radioactive waste, it comes to ODO for regulation, right? That's what we're talking about today. If it's radioactive but not waste, then it's typically RPS, OHA RPS regulations. and if it's waste but not radioactive, then it's typically DEQ regulations for disposal purposes. It's not quite that simple, but that's sort of a little frame of reference that I put together in my mind. As far as what materials in or out, the one thing that's specifically excluded, just to be clear here, Oregon, as people probably know, still hosts in Columbia County the spent nuclear fuel from the former Trojan nuclear power plant that was decommissioned 20 years ago or so. The spent nuclear fuel still sits out at the site in Columbia County. That is excluded by statute from this discussion, and so we're not getting into spent nuclear fuel discussion here. So just at least that's one point that's not part of this conversation by statute. I see Wayne has a hand up again.
Yeah, hey, thanks. So just for my own clarity, again, I might have missed it, but if it turns out that you know, we are actually looking at scenarios for exposure as a matter of risk assessment for various techniques of getting rid of or dealing with something that we would consider to be radioactive waste, then the exposure limits then would be very, very key. And Dave raised a good point about population exposure and that kind of thing, but it was unclear to me in the presentation about, do we actually have a brief to actually talk about that kind of limitation? Is it already a part of the law, or is that something that gets finagled here or discussed or moved forward? And that'll be a key issue, obviously. So anyway, the question for in the future or now, if you have it, it's fine. Thank you.
Wayne, this is Jeff here. I can, I guess, partially respond to that. The dose limit is established in the rule, not in the statute. The statute merely says would not present significant danger to public health and safety, or however it's worded. And then how that is defined as a dose basis is part of the rule. And I have heard several people during this discussion express an interest in diving deeper into the appropriate dose limits. And the second question is also trying to get to that idea of what are the circumstances under which you hold a waste to a dose limit. For instance, if you had a bag of waste, and it doesn't matter what it is, but you pass it past our 3 pathway tests and it fails. And our pathway tests assume that there are no landfill protections, but it fails. So that waste would be illegal for disposal in Oregon. But let's say that it got thrown into the trash can at your house and it went to a regular landfill, and someone did a risk assessment on it and found that it would not present a future risk based on just the simple normal circumstances of its disposal. I think one of the questions we're trying to get at is it appropriate that the state would forbid such disposal? And Tom wants to add a follow-up to that.
Yeah, and under that scenario, another question that would follow is, what requirements would there be for long-term monitoring for radionuclides at that facility if there was credit taken for cover and the like? And are we in fact then establishing it as a low-level waste facility, even though it's not really, and that's forbidden in statute?
Right, getting to the unintended consequences concept there.
So if I may, I believe now any kind of landfill just about has, most of them of any great consequence have some kind of radiation detection instrumentation at the front end. I honestly don't know how sensitive they are, but I suspect they're relatively sensitive, so that, you know, if you're any kind of photon emitting kind of something in the trash, you detect it and go track it down, figure out, you know, where it came from and what it was, that kind of thing. There's no question in my mind that if for some odd reason, a reason that we end result of this work is that we concentrate stuff in a landfill that is radioactive, that some level of monitoring has to occur. And even based on some level of historical assessment about what could end up there, that kind of thing, so you have some idea of how big the ball can get inside that pile. All of that would have, I mean, that's just part and parcel of what you do with disposing of something like that in a concentrated position. So yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. As I understand it, no, actually not all landfills in the state have a radiation portal detector that tracks my drive-through. Some do, some don't. Just to make that point. I don't see any other hands raised on my participant list panel here in WebEx. If there's anybody who hasn't spoken yet and would like to respond to the questions, now's a great time to do so. And if you feel like you just want to listen, sit back, and perhaps respond in writing to us, that would be great too, like we talked about at the beginning. But now's a good time if anybody has additional responses to the questions that hasn't spoken yet.
Everybody's brain is full. I did too. It's been a long meeting.
While I'm looking on the queue here, I know that Steve Reese from Oregon State University's Radiation Center has joined us. Steve, welcome.
Good. He's the other.
Not calling on you necessarily, just acknowledging that you're here on the meeting.
No, well, thanks, and I apologize for being late. I joined about just before 10. I was teaching this morning, so thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Okay. And Lisa, looks like you're back on, connected. I can see your name here. Again, just acknowledging you're here, not necessarily calling on you, but glad you're able to get back on. While we've been on this meeting, my organization's IT director sent us a message saying there's been statewide internet problems, and I don't know if it's just Oregon State government or what, but that might explain some of the connection issues and the lag time we had with the slide presentations earlier. So, okay. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands. Nobody's jumping up to speak. We're at 11:40 now, 11:41. There are a handful of people in the attendee list who are members of the public and not on the RAC, but we'd like to offer an opportunity for public comment. If anybody who's an attendee wishes to have a comment to say, you can do so now. You don't have to, of course, but if you would like to, I see there's 9 attendees in the list who if they would like to speak. Chris, I think can they raise a hand? Can they somehow indicate that they want to have something to say?
Hi, Max. Yeah, I believe the attendees can raise their hands. I actually can't unmute people from my end. So if anybody's trying to raise their hand and you can't, please go ahead and make a comment in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, we'll look for raised hands.
All right, nobody's jumping up and down, but right. Okay, well, that's our agenda. If there's anything else to speak up right now, please say so. That's the filled most of the time. Again, as we mentioned, if you want to have something in writing responding to those questions, or really anything else, just certainly let us know. And we will capture that material and share it with the full RAC. We are planning on doing the next meeting, as I mentioned, about 4 to 6 weeks out from now. We will send out, it'll come from Chris or from Chris's FSEC Rulemaking Coordinator email, another poll to gauge availability for folks' attendance at the next meeting. I hope that worked okay. I know we had, we've got 14 RAC members, we've got staff members. It's hard to get everybody together. Everybody's busy. So thank you for the patience and thanks for responding to those doodle polls. appreciate that to just try and schedule the next meeting where we can get maximum attendance from everybody.
Yeah,
really
and Max, I just to piggyback on that, since we are going into the holiday season, I mean, I think the most likely time in our time frame would be early December. But if any RAC members, have scheduled vacations where they'll be out for a long period of time, you can let me know that, and we can pick dates around that time.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because we're looking at probably the 5 to 6 weeks from now, not the 4, which would be right before Thanksgiving. I think that's probably right. Okay. All right. Is there anything else? Anybody else to add right now? Good for the cause? Otherwise, we'll end and give you 15 minutes back of your time in your day. Damon's giving me the thumbs up. Thank you. I really appreciate everybody's attendance. I really appreciate the participation today. Thank you. If you have feedback on how the meeting went or anything specific, let me know. Give me a call, or Chris, of course. We're all available. Thank you, everybody, again, and we will be in touch. Hope everybody has a good rest of their day. Thank you. Chris, are you saving the chat? And all
Thanks,
that?
everyone. I am saving the chat.
About it now. It asked me if I wanted to save it when I pressed close, and then I got a moment of panic. I will not save. Then I'll just let you do it, Chris.
All right. Great. Well, I have saved it locally, and Wally, if you want to save it where it's supposed to go, I don't actually know where within the WebEx.
Yeah, you can just save it to your, appropriate rulemaking folder. I mean, there's nowhere else that I would have to put it. I was going to mention too, I think with the attendees, the muting, unmuting, so, you have to now click on that request unmute, and then they have to, as a second step, unmute themselves. I think it's just kind of it's a safety feature. I know in one of the FSEC meetings that,